Before we get into the nitty-gritty in terms of the specific muscles, there's some terminology that we really need to make sure we understand before we move forward. And the main things that I want you to understand are the difference between origins and insertions. Okay, so you can see the terms here, origin and insertion. And a lot of times we've been moving away from these more traditional terms of origin and insertion. So oftentimes you'll hear the term proximal attachment, so the more proximal of the attachments, or distal attachment. And this is in particular when you're talking about appendicular muscles, so muscles associated with your appendages. Sometimes you can hear the term superior attachment and inferior attachment. They mean similar things, it's just in terms of the position of the muscles. So what do these mean? Well, typically the origin of a muscle is where the tendon is attaching to the more stable bone, okay? So that's an important thing to note. Typically we're talking about the attachment to the bone that's not moving, whereas the insertion is going to be the attachment to the bone that is going to be moving of the joint. So let's think about that when we think about our biceps muscle. Now the biceps muscle has two heads or two proximal attachments. These are attaching to the scapula here, and you can see that right here. The scapula, when the biceps brachii contracts, doesn't move at all. Okay, so that is going to be the origins of that. Whereas the biceps brachii is going to attach to the radial tuberosity for its insertion or distal attachment. So when the biceps brachii contracts here, it is going to move the radius or the forearm in order to allow for elbow flexion. Now, that's what we think of. That's kind of the schematic that you think of in terms of muscle attachments. Now, can the proximal attachment and the distal attachment switch in terms of their role? So reverse motion action? Absolutely. So sometimes this can allow for some type of movement in this region. But typically when we say origin insertion, we're talking about the main movement of that muscle. And for the biceps brachii, that's going to be flexion of the elbow. So typically that insertion is going to be pulled towards the origin. So if you think of that forearm flexing, it's being pulled towards the origin or the scapula here. So why do we care about origins and insertions? Well, it gives you an idea of which particular joints that muscle is crossing. And in order for a muscle to play a role in terms of the joint or the action of a joint, it has to cross that joint. Now, this is why we care. This is why it's worth understanding all of these attachment sites. One other point that I really want to get across is that muscles can cross more than one joint. So it can play a role in more than one joint. And that biceps brachii that we were just discussing is a really good example of that. It's actually a 3-joint muscle. So it can play a role in terms of 3 joints. The shoulder, it can play a role in terms of flexion of the shoulder. The elbow, this is its main action, which is going to be flexion of the elbow, as well as the proximal radio-ulnar, which is right next to the elbow joint, actually within that articular capsule. And so biceps brachii will actually be a very important supinator. So here's a pronated, supinated. It will play a role in terms of that. So this is a really good example of a 3-joint muscle. So now that we have a good understanding in terms of the terminology, as we get into the specifics of the muscles, keep note in terms of which particular joints these muscles are crossing.